I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this story of Jacob wrestling with God's messenger at the river. Whether recently or perhaps earlier on in life in Sunday school or vacation Bible school, undoubtedly this story is familiar to you. Perhaps you also remember an earlier chapter in the story of Jacob on which we are climbing Jacob's ladder. That hymn is based, which is, if you will, kind of the beginning story of Jacob fleeing home and going off to a strange country because he was afraid that his twin brother Esau would try to kill him, because together, conspiring with his mother, Jacob had managed to trick his father Isaac. Isaac had tricked Isaac out of giving Jacob, the younger of the twins, tricked Isaac into giving him the paternal blessing, which came with it the inheritance of the firstborn. So if you remember again, even earlier on, Isaac is the son of Abraham, so we have this connection between Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau in this lineage of primary characters in the early origin stories of Genesis, which comprise part of our shared faith heritage, part of the Abrahamic tradition, not only with Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam, all share this common heritage of this Abrahamic tradition. So again, Jacob's mother, for whatever reason, conspires with Jacob to trick Father Isaac as he is losing his sight in his old age, and to bestowing upon him the paternal blessing, and with that, the inheritance that is due the older son. Esau supposedly was the firstborn of the twins, and Jacob was named usurper, some say, because he was holding on to the heel of his brother who was the firstborn when he came out of the womb. Others say Jacob was named for his reddish hair and reddish complexion, this ruddiness. But however the case might be, when the plot was hatched and Jacob managed to trick the old man out of the paternal blessing, when Esau came on the scene and heard about what had happened, he swore that he would kill his brother Jacob, who not once but multiple times had tricked him out of his inheritance. And so then Jacob's mother says, "Oh, my son, get up and go to the land of my people, and there they will give you shelter." So he is self-exiled, exiled from home, out to this far country he'd never known before. And when he's on his way outbound from home to the foreign country, that's when he lays his head upon the stone at night, and that's when he has this vision of the angels going up and down the stairway. Another beautiful, beautiful painting by Marc Chagall representing that part of the story as well. But that's where the hymn Jacob's Ladder comes from. So again, think about that as on one of the bookends of the story when Jacob is outbound. Now, when he gets to the foreign country, his mother's people do take him in. You may recall just briefly some of that story. He fell in love with one of his, I think it would be uncle or great uncle's daughters, and asked for her hand. And the old man there said, "Well, if only you'll work for me 7 years, I will give you her hand in marriage," which he does do. But then he, the trickster, is tricked, and rather than marrying the younger sister that he was most fond of, he ends up marrying the older sister. And then in this polygamist society, the father says, "Well, now I make another deal with you, and if you'll only work for me 7 more years, then you can have her younger sister as well." So then he works another 7 years. But in the meantime, he becomes extraordinarily successful in his animal husbandry. There's some interesting talk there about speckled sticks and speckled goats that I don't quite all follow. But anyway, Jacob is extraordinarily successful to the point where his new in-laws become increasingly jealous of his success. By this point, Jacob has become incredibly fruitful and successful with his wives and with his children, with his multiplying flocks. His in-laws are jealous of him, and now they have it out for him. He doesn't really do very well in family relationships, does he? And so he has to flee for his life a second time. And where's he going to go this time? But to go back home again. And so we have kind of an early pioneer of the whole prodigal son story, right, that we hear about in the New Testament. But here the prodigal son Jacob, who's gone off to the far country, he's been extraordinarily successful, but now there's yet another set of family members who have it out for him. And so now he travels back again, but yet this time, rather than traveling all by himself, he has these hordes and flocks of wives and children and servants and, goats and sheep and who knows what all else. And so there's this whole caravan, this whole kind of like, wagon train, Oregon Trail thing going on, right? So for days and days and days, they're traveling. And when they get to the border, the boundary of his home country, he sends out some of his servants, some of his shepherds, to kind of scout out the territory. And much to his chagrin and his fear, the servant scouts come back and they say, yes, your brother Esau has gotten word of your return. Now, how would they do that? There was no internet or email or text messaging, but somehow brother Esau back home had gotten word that Jacob was coming back home again, and Esau's coming out to meet you with hundreds of his men, and they don't look very happy. And so Jacob what is he going to do? He's between a rock and a hard place, right? He can't go back to where he'd been because there his in-laws had it out for him. And if he continues forward, he's afraid that his brother Esau and all of his collaborators have it in for him, and he might just die. So being the resourceful patriarch that he is, what does he do? He organizes all of his people and all of his flocks and sends them out in waves or bunches across the river ahead of him. So this is the general that's at the very, very, very back of the troops. He sends them all out in front of him in waves, and servants and shepherds with each of them, and he instructs the servants, when you meet my brother Esau, say to him that your humble servant Jacob bows down to you, and please accept these as a gift from me to you, his flocks, his animals. And who knows exactly what the intent was, but even all of his women folk and his children, he sends them out ahead as well to somehow kind of appease his brother Esau, or maybe at least calm down some of his rage, right? So he sends them all out ahead of himself while he sleeps there beside the river Jabbok, the boundary of his home country. And this time, while he's sleeping, he doesn't see the ministering angels going up and down the staircase saying, hey, Jacob, you're special. God loves you. Welcome to the land of milk and honey. This time, the messenger comes and begins wrestling with him. And it's not just like a little play wrestling like you do when you're a kid with your, siblings. This is like he realizes this is like martial arts death wrestling. And so throughout the night, he wrestles and he wrestles. And during the course of the wrestling, Jacob's hip is broken. His hip is thrown out of joint, and we hear later that he had a limp for the rest of his life, right? He had that scar, that wound with him for the rest of his life. And as they begin to see the glimmering light of sunrise on the horizon, the angel finally says, let go of me, let go of me. Like the sun is rising, I need to go back up to heaven with God again. And Jacob says, no, I won't let you go until you tell me your name. Of course, the messenger was not having any of that, but the messenger, rather than giving Jacob their name, says to Jacob, from now on, you'll no longer be Jacob, the usurper, the cheater, the trickster. Now you'll be known as Israel, the one who wrestles with God and survived, the one who wrestles with God and perseveres and carries on. And so dawn comes. Could we say that Jacob might be a changed man, perhaps? He eventually follows in the footsteps of all of his herds and servants and wives and children. And what happens when he meets Esau? Do you remember the climax of that story? Just as he had instructed his servants, when he meets Esau, he falls down before him, lays face down in the dust, and proclaims his utter sorrow, his regrets, his apology for stealing Esau's proper inheritance, and just places himself at Esau's mercy. At which point, much like we hear in Jesus' story of the prodigal son, rather than taking out his wrath on his brother, Esau picks him up and hugs him and kisses him and says, welcome home, brother. Welcome home. So I was thinking about this story this week on last Monday. Some of you may know that last Monday was Canadian Thanksgiving. You know that, right? But it was also historically celebrated in the U.S. as Columbus Day, and more recently, for some people, Indigenous Peoples Day. You may know that, this last Monday, the 10th. And through our connections with other churches in our larger Portland metro area, including the Land and Housing Coalition, I received an invitation and went to a celebration at Laurelhurst Presbyterian Church, which is a large, I would say at least as large, if not larger than St. Paul's, in size of facility, in a beautiful square block in inner northeast Portland, fairly close to the Hollywood Transit Center and fairly close to Providence Portland Medical Center. But it's in a beautiful residential neighborhood. I know when I was pastor of Tabor Heights in southeast Portland in the early 2000s, it seemed to me that Laurelhurst Presbyterian and Tabor Heights had a lot of things in common. In fact, the member of the Tabor Heights Church who built that church also built this beautiful Laurelhurst church. And so there was a celebration there at the Laurelhurst Presbyterian Church on Indigenous Peoples Day, because that church had decided to give their entire church building back to their presbytery, their version of the annual conference. And their presbytery had decided to give the entire property to an organization called the Future Generations Collaborative, which provides for the needs of Native Americans, of Indigenous people. And so specifically as known as Barbie's Project, and you can kind of think of Barbie and Ken because his name is Ken and her name is Barbie, but it is specifically going to be used for housing Native American elders, the property. And I'm not intimating that this is the route that St. Paul should or could or would take, but it's very remarkable to me to see a very real example about what could happen, what the possibilities are when there is collaboration among many different organizations. And one of the spokeswomen for the Future Generations Collaborative was interviewed by local news, and she was part of the presentation that evening at the church outside on the lawn. And she made this comment about how so much of our culture is based on competition. And in the midst of competition, the taking of property by the stronger party from the weaker party is something that happens all too often. And I think all of us can think of a current example in our world when that has happened, when a stronger party has taken property from a weaker party. And so the point was that in this transformation of relationships, the relationships are being healed and transformed from a relationship of competition, of taking away from, to collaboration and sharing with. And so this project that's happening now at the Laurelhurst Presbyterian Church property is an example of what can happen when there is collaboration among many different organizations and this shift in orientation from taking from to sharing with. Now, I share all that because it feels to me like that's very, very apropos of this story of Esau and Jacob. Because certainly in this story, Jacob took the rightful inheritance of his brother Esau and expected in this world of competition for scarce resources that when he came back home again, Esau would take back what was rightfully his by use of force. But rather, what did happen was this beautiful healing and reconciliation that occurred when Esau welcomed his brother and says, "What did you mean by sending all these animals and your family on ahead of you? What did you mean by that?" Because, honestly, it seems like Jacob was trying to buy off Esau, right? But rather than seeing it as a competition between the weaker and the stronger, Esau welcomed it as an opportunity for collaboration, of joining together hearts and minds and energies and families and resources. Now, many people have asked over the last year and a half of my ministry here with you, what is St. Paul's doing? There's been a lot of talking around here. What is St. Paul's doing? Whether it was in the mission discovery process or over the last year with the Land and Housing Coalition, and very reasonably, many of you have asked, what is this all about? Why are we doing this? Or what are we doing? We're doing a lot of talking, but what are we doing? And I'm pleased to tell you that we here at St. Paul's now have an amazing challenge and opportunity to engage ourselves in civic discourse and public support for an immediate decision here in our county which can save hundreds of lives. We have an opportunity to make a difference in a decision here in Clackamas County that almost undoubtedly could save hundreds of lives. Some of you have read about that, I hope, this last week in the weekly and again in the special announcement that went out yesterday, the addendum to the worship invitation, when I was inviting you all to be a part of the process of mobilizing public support here in Clackamas County for something called Project Turnkey, which is essentially, as I understand it at least, federal monies. I believe they're probably, COVID relief monies that came from the federal government to the state government, and the state of Oregon has offered them to counties across Oregon to purchase and operate emergency shelter for homeless people. Now, the interesting thing here in Clackamas County is that once before Clackamas County has been granted these funds from the state and ended up passing on the opportunity. our current Board of County Commissioners decided not to go forward with a project like this. And now this fall, there was preliminary approval, preliminary offer of grant funds from the state to Clackamas County. And now our Clackamas County Board of Commissioners plans to vote by the end of this month on whether or not to accept the funds and proceed with the project to purchase a couple of existing motel properties in Clackamas County and transition them into full-time emergency shelter with all the necessary supportive wraparound services, social services, health care, mental health support, addiction recovery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of you, if you've read the information that was emailed out to you, but even if you haven't, there was a recent article in the Clackamas Review about this, and Sue Sayers brought that to my attention. So you can look up the information there, but kind of bringing this to a closure, here at St. Paul's, we will be kind of a hub of activity. We will be hosting a meeting here on Tuesday evening. Just like our Sunday morning worship, it will be a hybrid meeting where folks can participate in person or online on Zoom. We're hosting the meeting here. We're hosting the Zoom meeting here. And this is to learn more about what's happening with this project, to learn more about kind of the current state of affairs, the current thinking of our current 5-member Board of County Commissioners. And I can tell you that the analysis that's been done by colleagues of mine, of ours here in Clackamas County is like, as it stands right now, our Board of County Commissioners will probably reject this opportunity for a second time. And with that, probably the opportunity is lost and gone forever. But there is a sense that at least a couple of the current commissioners may be open to being influenced by public opinion, and therefore there's this effort to mobilize people of faith and other community partners to come together to understand the situation and then to act together in concert to see if the decision might go in favor of this project. Now, I don't assume that everyone listening to me agrees with the project. I don't assume that. However, I am saying that there is an opportunity, should you choose to learn more about it, and would you like to become involved in public support, public advocacy, public witness, that you're very welcome to participate in the meeting on Tuesday night in person or online, and then determine whether or not you would like to take that next step, whether it's a letter to the editor, whether it's an email, whether it's being a part of showing up in person at one of the upcoming county commissioner board meetings these next 2 Thursday mornings prior to their vote. There'll be a number of different ways that you can be involved. And while this particular activity is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of the Land and Housing Coalition work, it is one example of the kind of work that can happen. And I think I shared with you previously that in September we hosted a leadership retreat of all of the key leaders of the Land and Housing and other adjacent community organizations here at St. Paul's. And one of the stories that was told was how in Portland, when they were trying to get permission to build what is now a veterans housing shelter at the Portsmouth Union Church in North Portland, where Jules Nielsen was pastor, they kept on running into all these zoning issues and these conditional use issues. And it was only when they began to ask the right questions and to organize that they found that they had a key ally in the city staff, the City of Portland staff, who was looking for community partners to address this issue. And when they had a show of support show up at the Portland Planning Commission, they were able to get a change in Portland zoning and conditional use so that now projects like the Veterans Housing Project are going forward. But they didn't stop there. They then organized with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, and in the last General Legislative Assembly, they changed the law for the entire state of Oregon so that now faith communities can offer property for affordable housing under the current state regulations that they could not before. Now, I know this is probably pretty foreign to most of us to get involved at this level of public activity, but we don't really have to stretch our imagination that far to think about the role of faith communities of churches in the U.S. civil rights movement, right? That was a different time, that was a different place, but we know that faith communities had a huge role there. I remember in the 1980s, kind of out of college and as a young adult, I remember that in Poland, emerging out of the totalitarian dictatorship there, the Catholic Church had a huge role to play in coming together with unions to bring about the democratization of Poland and electing their first democratic president, Lech Walesa. Some of you may remember that as well. So it's not as if churches have never gotten involved in ways like this in public debate. And I think also, if we think about our Christian origins, I mean, very, very bluntly, why was Jesus crucified by the Romans? Because he was perceived as a threat to the status quo of the public order, right? So both the religious and the political leaders of his day conspired to kill Jesus and make an example of him. And I'm not saying that any of us are marching to the cross here, but who knows? I mean, who knows? Certainly we think of greats like Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others who did literally lay their lives on the line, right? So for us, this is just simply an opening, an opportunity, an invitation to those who choose to participate, to be a part of this collaborative movement, to see if we can move the dial on the decision, perhaps from 3 against to 2-4, to 2 against and 3-4. That's all we need to do, is maybe move one commissioner. So can we do it? I don't know. Could we do it? Yes, I believe we could do it. Now the question is, will we? Will we join in that effort? And I can just tell you that for myself, I'm committed to doing whatever I can in these next couple of weeks to lend my support to that effort. And I'm hoping others of you may be willing to do so as well. So thanks to you for your willingness, at least, to put up with me and perhaps even entertain the possibility. Certainly if you have more questions, I'm sorry we don't have a whole forum set up to discuss this. But again, there's very good information available via email. If you need additional information, you're welcome to contact me. Or the best thing is just simply to participate here on Tuesday evening from 6:30 to 8, either in person or with a Zoom link. And I'm sure we'll be sending that out again tomorrow in the weekly if you're interested. And also just email me if you have thoughts or questions about that. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you. And I know earlier when we were just preparing for the sermon, just a couple of thoughts came to mind for me from our liturgy today. First from our call to worship, I will make a new covenant with you and I will write it on your hearts. What might the relevance be? Whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me, to thinking about those who are vulnerable and marginal. And from the Psalms, the importance of how God creates a safe home, a safe shelter for us. So how can we together be the hands and feet of God here in Clackamas County in 2022? Amen.